It's a huge privilege to be sat on the stage with one of my heroes, and if you're into Jaguar, he'll be one of your heroes as well. He was CEO and chairman of Jaguar Cars between 1980 and 1990. And in that 10 years, he released Jaguar from the British Leyland grasp. It was sold to Ford afterwards, but the value increased from £300 million to £1.6 billion. I think this man knows a thing or two about rescuing companies like Jaguar. Please, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for the man who saved Jaguar, Sir John Egan. Wonderful to have you here, Sir John. Is that a title that sits comfortable with you, the man who saved Jaguar?
Well, certainly it had to be saved. MG had gone, Triumph was on its way, and I think if I hadn't turned up on the day I did, Jaguar would have gone as well.
Tell us about the sort of welcome you had at Jaguar, and just put us back in the picture of just how difficult things were at that time, because you know, we'd had Lofty England who had taken over. He'd been unceremoniously kicked out after a year. A young guy, Geoffrey Robinson, had taken over, who had some great ideas for Jaguar. But then, of course, the Ryder report arrived. Rationalisation was upon us. You must have come to a company that was in the midst of some real turmoil.
Yeah, I inherited large car assembly plant number 2. The Jaguar name had been taken down, and it was British Leyland large car assembly plant number 2. So they'd actually tried to gather strength from Jaguar, but actually they were in the process of destroying it. The chairman that when I arrived, was a man called Percy Plant, and when things got into his hands, they were sold off or closed down. He was the expert in doing that. So I realized when I arrived that I didn't have much time to sort things out. And when I did arrive on that day, they were on strike. Everybody was on strike. And it was about a very serious issue. Michael Edwards wanted to pay everybody for doing the same job, the same wage, throughout British Leyland. And that meant the assembly workers at Jaguar were going to be paid the same as those at Longbridge. And when I arrived at the factory gates, everybody was on strike, and I started talking to the strikers. And one of them really did strike me. He said, "I've got my bag of tools here. Without these tools, these cars don't fit." He said, I'm a craftsman. At Longbridge, they're just fitters. And he said, British Leyland have done all these things to us. I don't want to work here anymore if that's what's going to happen to me. They've done everything else to us, and now they've done this. And so really, in a way, everybody was fed up of being owned by British Leyland, and they really didn't see any real future. And indeed, when I started talking to the shop stewards, I realized that the only thing on offer was me. I was saying, well, I've come here to save the place. I've come here to make it as independent as it deserves. That was the deal I'd done with Michael Edwards. I knew it couldn't run as part of British Leyland, but we couldn't get independence if we didn't earn it. And so we had to earn it. And I knew that the shop stewards might come along with me when they understood that in the end point, we might become independent again.
A great insight there that actually, contrary to what a lot of the press reported at the time and the sort of story we get told now of staff that didn't care and were stood around braziers, actually I can already hear when you arrived, there was a great sense of pride around Jaguar.
Yes, I mean, I knew, I'd worked for British Leyland before. I'd created the Unipart business, which was all the parts businesses of all of the companies. And so I did understand And at Jaguar, I understood that there really was a pride of working for Jaguar. And I knew that when I could talk direct to the workforce, they would come with me and they would do their best to help the company survive. Incidentally, we had a couple of things going for us. One was Margaret Thatcher. She certainly wasn't going to stand for companies owned by the government going on strike. She just closed them down. I think everybody understood that. Michael Edwards was a tough guy, and he did what he said he'd do. But also, the Series 3 was a very beautiful improvement to the Series 2. And I felt it was almost like a new car, and we could almost take it as a new car into the United States. So I felt, as a salesman, there was a chance for this company because of that car.
And of course, Castle Bromwich, where that car was being built, had the history of building Spitfires during the Second World War. There's a story that, perhaps a bit of a myth, that you turned up to Castle Bromwich and found that they were only able to spray the car's 3 colours. And it was the beginning of the story of how you had to turn around some of the quality issues that were within the production line at the time. Was that the case?
Yeah, but there's actually a rather more interesting story behind that. When Mike Beasley and I walked around Castle Bromwich, he said to me, "Do you notice there isn't a single black face in this workforce?" And so when we met the plant director, we said, "Why are there no black faces here? We've got plenty of them at Browns Lane. Why is there nobody here?" And he was very uncomfortable. He said, "Well, the unions don't send any up here. They don't allow us to employ any black people." So, well, we said, bring the shop stewards in then. And we said to him, "Look, you're going to have to make a choice here. It's us or it's the police. If we bring the police in, you're all going to prison because it's illegal to bar black people from the workforce. And we will certainly bring them here. So you're going to have to choose right now." And actually, they chose to go with us rather than the police. And actually, it became fairly quickly probably the easiest plant for us to run.
Let's talk about some of the models that sort of were icons of your era, I guess. And I guess it really starts with that Series 3 XJ6, but also the XJ40, because that XJ40 was waiting in the wings, wasn't it, for quite some time? What was the decision behind postponing that launch?
Well, the XJ40 was sort of under design when I got there, and I used it as a symbol of hope for the future. I said, "Look, to the shop stewards, if you don't help me get this company to survive, I'm not going to ask for any money from the government to invest in a new model." So the XJ40 was a symbol of hope. But we really didn't have time to wait for the XJ40. We had to make a success of the XJ6. The Series 3 was a really very good development of the Series 2. It was a really beautiful improvement. And I felt if we could make it work, because it had 18 faults per car in its first year of ownership, and versus, other cars had faults too. A Mercedes would have had 4 or 5 faults. So we had to go from 18 faults per car down to 4 or 5 to make the car saleable. And that in itself was a story, because it wasn't just Jaguar's problems. Half the problems we bought in from our outside suppliers. So we had to do a huge job with our suppliers to make improvements. And I took on the worst 5 suppliers myself. And everyone was a different story. But the worst one had a fault rate of 40% of the failures in the first year of warranty. What an incredible problem that was. But still, we managed to cure it. We managed to fix it. But every single one of those fault codes, and there were 150 of them, had to be fixed to get us down to 4 or 5 faults per car.
And of course, while you were taking control of quality control with the road cars, the XJS I mentioned because it was during your era that the relationship with Tom Walkinshaw Racing came about. That won the European Touring Car Championship. And I think anyone who looks back on that moment in history now can see the change that made to what was initially a faltering model. The XJS had a bit of a stillbirth, hadn't it, because of the engine and the fuel crisis that you'd had to endure. That race win made all the difference. Was, from the very beginning, motorsport really important to your strategy?
Yes, motorsport was extremely important. It had helped to create the original Jaguar. And in putting Jaguar back together again, I knew there had to be a place for racing. And it was at the Geneva Motor Show that I met Jackie Stewart. And I told him what I wanted to do. And he said, well, I know of someone who can help you. And his name is Tom Walkinshaw. And this tornado came into my office about 3 or 4 weeks later, explaining that the XJS was a magnificent potential race car, which at great cost could win the European Touring Car Championship. And I said to him, but Tom, I don't have any money. So he said, that's not much of a problem. I'll find the money. And between us, we found enough money to get started. And I paid him on the basis of winning. He got £20,000 to win and £10,000 if he was third. It was a magnificent racing car, was the XJS. It was a magnificent car. And with that V12 engine, which as we developed it, it got better and better and better. Eventually, when we won Le Mans, it was developing over 800 horsepower, which was a heck of a thing for basically a production engine.
The link between the touring car and obviously the production XJS is an obvious one, but in order to win Le Mans, you had to go into Group C, and those are prototype cars. Now, obviously Bob Tullius over in America had been doing great things for the Jaguar brand already. That very famous moment in 1984 where Group 44 came over with those IMSA spec race cars, did you ever consider that Group 44 might be the guys for the job, or was it the fact that TWR were based in the UK, that's what gave them the edge, made them more important at the time?
Well, it was as soon as we were privatized and I got rid of British Leyland, I felt as though we could invest enough money into racing to actually win Le Mans. And I gathered everybody together, Tom Walkinshaw and Bob Tullius from the States and all of the guys who knew about racing, and we tried to come to a decision. Did we develop a new car, or did we give the IMSA car to Tom for him to develop it for Le Mans and have 2 teams? Anyway, eventually, Tom said he'd give it a try, but he went with the car to see the guys at Williams. We knew the Williams people really quite well, and they were very interested in working with Jaguar. And when he went to see them, he made a very interesting point. He said the IMSA car developed by Bob Tullius was already 2 or 3 years old, and a space frame car had been made by Porsche for the last 10 years. They'd always be 10 years ahead of us. The only way we could beat Porsche was basically to have a Formula One car. And so what we had to do was to use Formula One engineering. And that had to be done in the UK. And that's, in a way, Tom came to see me and he said, I don't want to do the IMSA. It's a waste of time. If we want to win, we have to start from scratch and build a Formula One car around the V12 engine. And that's what we did. And it was a magnificent job for our engineers because Tom only had enough engineering to do about half the job or 2/3 of the job. We had to do a lot of it ourselves. The engine we had to do ourselves, the brakes and things like that. So our engineers were already involved in sort of world-class activity, which is good for them. If they're going to build world-class cars, they really have to learn somewhere. I mean, I thought racing was one place to start.
Just talking about the subject brings me up in goosebumps, I have to say. And to think that we're sat here in Bicester, and just a few miles over there is Kidlington, where Tom Walkinshaw Racing was based when they built all of those cars. It was a 3-year program, wasn't it? 87 was a tough year at Le Mans with reliability issues for a lot of the cars. Porsche pipped the team that year. But in 1988, of course, famously, the number 2 car brought it home for Jaguar with Jan Lammers, Andy Wallace at the wheel. Tell us your memories of being stood, because you were there, weren't you, at Le Mans? Tell us your memories of that moment when you saw Jaguar win Le Mans. It must have been incredible.
Yeah, it was. We knew we had a good chance. We were taking 5 cars over there, 2 that were racing in the US and 3 that were racing in Europe. So we had 5 teams there. So we felt as though we were going with enough horsepower. Obviously, Porsche had 2 or 3 themselves, but there were always a number of privateers working with Porsche. So we felt taking 5 cars gave us a chance. The difficulty that we always had, however, was developing the experience of a team to win such a. It's so difficult to get the teamwork together, and I remember it was very interesting watching the various teams of drivers working together to work how to win. And I was very impressed with the team that won. It was Jan Lammers who was the leader of the team. And he walked the 3 drivers around the course, and they agreed how they were going to drive. And it's attention to detail, the sort of stuff that year after year after year Porsche had been winning, but we had to learn all of that. And we'd failed a couple of times, but now we really had the horsepower to win.
We must mention the 3rd driver in that winning car in 1988, Johnny Dumfries, of course, who we lost earlier this year, very sadly. When you got home on Monday morning from Le Mans that year, there is the old saying that was coined way back in the 1950s, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Did you sit back and think, wow, we've got to live up to this reputation now? Was that a genuine challenge at the time?
Gosh, no. I just was busy. And I think every single year at Jaguar, I was there for 10 years, every single year had its crisis. There was nothing, at no time would you say that this was a steady state. In 1988, already, Ford were starting to nose around, and they were starting to kick the tires, and we'd started to think we really did need a partner in the big league if we were going to develop the technologies for the future. Our choice was Toyota. We felt that they would be sufficiently far away that they might invest in us and share their technology with us. I don't know whether news of this had got through to Ford, but they were already starting to be quite aggressive about their relationship with us. And so I felt as though Ford would not be capable of working with us. I felt that they would just simply have to run it as part of Ford. So I was really quite antagonistic to the idea and was all the way through. But already that was beginning to be a problem. So every year had its crisis, and that was 1988 was that crisis.
Having taken Jaguar from the grip of British Leyland, it's clear talking to you now that the mission always had to be to get Jaguar independent and to think for itself and to work for itself. Was it a difficult decision then 10 years later to stare a Ford takeover in the face? Did it sort of go against what you felt you'd done already?
I was mortified. I really did feel as though I'd failed, because I felt that Ford would not be a satisfactory owner. Sure, they spent an awful lot of money at Jaguar, losing money and investing it was let me tell you a tiny little story. After they'd bought Jaguar, the new chairman, because the old chairman that had bought Jaguar was sort of pushed out, and the new man was a guy called Red Poling. And when I went over to Detroit, he drew me into his office. He seemed to be the only person interested in talking to me. And he said to me, "Say, John, how am I going to tell my shareholders I've spent 5 times asset value on buying a car company?" He said, "I don't think there's a single car company in the world worth its assets. And I've just paid 5 times the asset value for Jaguar." And I said to him, "Red, when I was taught to be a salesman, I was taught to sell the sizzle, not the sausage. You've got $500 million worth of sausage here, but you have $2 billion worth of sizzle. And if you don't understand sizzle, you shouldn't buy Jaguar. You shouldn't have bought Jaguar." Now, the one company in the world that did not understand sizzle was Ford. They just sold sausages. They just don't understand sizzle. And he was shaking his head in disbelief. But anyway, the thing about a Jaguar is it's got to have more to it than just sausage. It's got to have sizzle as well. You have to try and make a better car than anybody else in the world has made. Otherwise, you shouldn't try to make Jaguars.
When you look back on your 10 years at the helm of Jaguar, when you look back on the responsibility you had for something that is an integral part of British motor history, are there things, as you look through the wonderful thing of hindsight, that you would have done differently sat here today? When you look back, is there anything, any one moment you wish you'd taken a slightly different decision, perhaps?
Yeah, there were at least two, where I felt as though I'd made a mistake. At one stage, BMW wanted to buy Jaguar, and I got on very well with the chairman of BMW, a man called von Kuhnheim. And he came over all on his own, and he just sat me in his office, and he told me what he wanted to do. So I sat in my office and told me what he wanted. And I felt, and it was early on, it was only sort of 3 or 4 years into the turnaround, and I felt as though there was no end to what we could do. And I said, "If you buy it, you might buy it without the management." And he said he wasn't going to do that. And I think that might have been a mistake. I think they might have been a very good owner. They've certainly done very well with Mini, and they could have, I think they did understand luxury cars, and they did understand about the luxury car business. I think the second mistake I probably made was the Series 3 was selling very well, and I had privatized the company, so I now was able to make a decision. I privatized the company because, incidentally, at the time we did, because BL wanted to launch the XJ40 back in 1984. That's 2 years before we did launch it, and it wasn't ready. I mean, it was certainly not, the engineering wasn't up to the standard of a Jaguar. So I said we should privatize before we launched the XJ40. But when we'd privatized, I wasn't sure whether to start again, because the whole technique of design of cars had changed. In 1984, you designed them on a computer before you started. You didn't try and do bits here and there. We designed XJ40 in the old-fashioned sense, and then we had to sort of bring modernity into our styling and to our ideas and all the rest of it. And I always felt as though I should have started again. By the way, the person who persuaded me not to start again was actually Bill Lyons. He said, "No, you don't need to. It's a perfectly good car. This is exactly the right car from a styling point of view." But of course, he could rely on a team of fantastic engineers underneath him who'd always made his cars. So he didn't really bother much about what went on inside it. It was actually the style, which was to him the key. So he persuaded me that the car was fit to go. And rather reluctantly, we then proceeded, because and I kept putting it off, because I was really quite frightened. Actually, in the end, we didn't do a bad job, but we could have done better.
Did you have a good relationship with Sir William Lyons as you went
yes.
through? Because you're both Lancastrians, aren't you? You're both
yes.
Lancastrians, aren't you?
Yeah, he was always anxious to see me. When I used to get to Wappenbury Hall, he'd have the sherry out, and he'd have his list of stuff he wanted to talk about. We gave him free access to the styling studios, and it was interesting. When he went into the styling studio, he lost 20 or 30 years in age. He was quite determined when he was in there. And he was quite old when he was outside it, but in there, I remember saying I didn't really know whether we were right to go for the rectangular headlamp on the XJ40. And he just turned to me and he said, "But I am." And it was interesting. He was really quite tough-minded, even at that age, he knew what he wanted, and he thought the car was right.
Well, I saw an XJR XJ40 coming in the entry road this morning as we were warming up the stage here, and I agree with him. I think absolutely right to go with that stance.
But by the way, one of the other things that I was really proud of was the XJS, because they'd stopped making them when I arrived in 1980, and we sold 10,000 in 1990. So it was a very successful sports car, and of course, a fantastic racing car.
And of course, back then, Jaguar were running these TWR road cars as well, which were something that's commonplace in the motor industry now, to have a third-party tuning house build. Mercedes do it very well, build your sported-up cars. Did that feel like an integral part in following up on that motorsport heritage that you were building at the time then?
Yes, I felt that there was value added with all of the association with racing. And certainly, with the V12 engine, racing it at Le Mans and putting it into a road car. For example, there were guys in Florida were turning up at the dealership as though they'd won Le Mans themselves. It was a real connection. And of course, BMW had been very good at doing that, and I felt as though that was something that between us and Tom Walkinshaw we could do.
We have a new man at the helm of Jaguar now, Thierry Bolloré. If you were called into his office, you might have been, I don't know, but if you were called into his office and he asked for your advice on where to take Jaguar now, as we sit here in 2021, what would you say to him?
Well, I think he's already made some very interesting points, and I think one of them is that it's a luxury car, and it should always have that luxury end of it. It's interesting that in the XJ series, they didn't quite get it right. The XF and the XE, okay, they're turning into luxury cars, but they didn't start off that. And I think that losing the XJ as a volume car was a mistake. So I think the luxury end you should be part of. You can't run away from that if you're Jaguar. So I would concentrate on making luxury cars.
Must be a proud moment for you as well, as we look over all the display cars over there on the field across those beautiful E-types. There's a huge number of XJSs, Series 3 XJ6s, XJ40s, of course all the cars that then followed in the Ford era after you had secured Jaguar's existence. Do you still feel a sense of pride looking out over that vista in front of us?
Oh, I feel an enormous sense of pride. I think, this was worth saving. This was a wonderful thing. And I was brought up in Coventry. My parents moved to Coventry when I was still 14 or so. And I felt the idea of Jaguar going out of business was so terrible that I had to do what I could to save it. And so I felt as though I'd done a good thing in actually enabling the company to survive.
Well, I think everyone here would agree with you. He's certainly done a good thing. And the fact that Sir John Egan worked so hard between 1980 and 1990 to release Jaguar from the grip of British Leyland, to develop those new models as he's now described, and to push it forward into its new era is the fact, it gives us the fact that we're all here to enjoy the Jaguars today and be together and enjoy wonderful cars. So I think for that, it deserves a really big round of applause to Sir John Egan, the man who saved Jaguar.